At this point in time, it is no surprise, and it is notoriously known that the final boss of Shadow of the Erdtree is Radahn. Particularly, it is the revived body of Radahn that has been combined with the soul of Mog. Both of the demigods are conjoined in order to amass power in favor of Miquella, yet another demigod, who is taking their shot at becoming Elden Lord. In this case, Miquella wants to bring forth the Age of Compassion, and much like everyone involved in this Game of Thrones, us included, the best way to bring about your preferred kingdom is by force. This is a setup for a boss fight that is supposed to be the magnificent and glorious conclusion to the Elden Ring story, much like Slave Knight Gale was for the Souls series. And yet, my dear viewer, I cannot help but feel extremely disappointed at the end result. Without a shadow of a doubt, I did not like promised Consort Radahn. Why did I not like the boss fight? Well, let's get started. The first thing that I want to make perfectly clear is that my dislike of this boss fight has nothing to do with its difficulty. I do not believe that this boss fight is too hard. In the same way, I do not believe that it was easy, at least before the nerfs. In my opinion, the final boss of Shadow of the Erdtree was very well balanced. It wasn't perfect, because nothing is, but I felt that when it comes to its difficulty, Promised Consort Radahn was a very well designed fight. The two phases are actually very well presented. In the first one, we fight Radahn in his prime of ability, without the affliction of the rot hindering him and without the burden of having to hold back the stars. And then, during the second phase, we find that a bested Radahn receives the holy help of Miquella, adding the power of kindness, understanding, and compassion to his arsenal. Unfortunately for us, this kindness and compassion translates into pillars of light and after images that constantly harass us. The two phases are actually very similar. When we simmer down Radahn's moves, he does the exact same attacks in phase 2 as he did in phase 1. The only difference is the added pillars of light and the after images that increase the number of hits for each corresponding attack. Besides this, we get a few new attacks in phase 2. They are Miquella's Light and Radahn's signature Meteor Crash when we get his HP to about 30%. Overall, if a player understands phase 1, then they will understand phase 2. Dodging the attacks of phase 2 is near identical to dodging the attacks of phase 1. You just have to stick closer to Radahn in order to avoid the additional light pillars. Overall, once the player understands this, they will realize that phase 2 has to be fought almost exactly like phase 1, with some additional smoke and mirrors. And still, FromSoft decided to nerf Promised Consort Radahn. I have to say that these nerfs were mostly unneeded. Like I mentioned before, I believe that the boss fight was very well balanced in its natural state. Promised Consort Radahn was nerfed in two different ways. First, there are a few of his attacks that were slowed down and given additional recovery. My dear viewer, I will be honest, the nerfs to slow down Radahn's attacks were too much. After spending 5 hours learning the fight as it was originally intended, fighting the new nerfed Radahn feels like he's in slow motion. Sure, I still get hit because I suck at the game, but the amount of difficulty is considerably lower. It is clear that my success rate is much higher after the nerfs, and I certainly think that this was not necessary. On the other hand, Radahn suffered an additional nerf to the visual effects of his light pillars and after images. This nerf makes it easier to see and identify these moves, and it generates less visual clutter in the player's screen. Now this, my dear viewer, is a nerf that I can get behind. In all honesty, part of Radahn's difficulty in Shadow of the Erdtree comes from the fact that it is very hard to see what was happening on the screen during the second phase. Let's be honest, how many times did you get hit because you couldn't understand what was happening? How many times did you get hit by light pillars because they came out of nowhere? By reducing the visual clutter and allowing the player to more easily identify Radahn's attacks, it helps the learning process. As a result, players can improve quicker, leading to faster success. As I said before, this is the kind of change that I approve of. It doesn't make the boss easier, but it gives the player an easier time learning and understanding the moves. And that is always a good thing. Furthermore, I believe that there is another nerf that Radahn could have received. One that would have made the fight easier, yes, but without really lowering the boss's difficulty. I am sure that you remember how Radahn has this one attack in which he uses gravity magic to fly upwards, hang out in the air, and shoot meteors down at you. This attack has two offensive hitboxes: the initial upward slashes done when he goes into the air, and then the meteors as they are coming down. Now, the problem with this attack is that Radahn hangs out in the air for a really long time, and this runs the timer on his stance damage recovery. In case you don't know, this means that all of the stance damage that you dealt to Radahn before the attack will be completely recovered by the time he comes down. This is bad because the player has no way to damage him while he's in the air, and as a result, there is nothing we can do to stop this regeneration. Unfortunately, this makes it harder to break his stance. It is my opinion that an appropriate nerf to Radahn would be to stop his stance damage regeneration while he is in the air. In this way, when he comes back down, we can continue attacking him and capitalizing on the damage we dealt before he took flight. In this way, the attacks don't change, but we are still able to take advantage of the stance damage we have already dealt, which will lead to more breaks and, in turn, more damage. This would make the fight easier while maintaining the natural difficulty of the boss. These kinds of nerfs feel more fair than just simply making the boss slower or having it deal less damage to the player. The bottom line is that Radahn is with all certainty the hardest boss in the game and even the hardest boss that FromSoft has ever created. That being said, it is my opinion that its difficulty is very well balanced. This is not the problem. The problem, in fact, stems from things that have nothing to do with how the boss fight is, and instead have everything to do with how the boss fight could have been. Let's move on to the circumstances that truly bothered me, that truly affected me, the situation that really got to me. I think that in this boss fight, FromSoft did Radahn a huge disservice. This boss fight is extremely disrespectful to Radahn's might, to Radahn's aura, and to Radahn's reputation. In Elden Ring, the base game, Radahn is depicted as the strongest demigod who fought Malenia to a stalemate, who attempted the siege of Leyndell only to be defeated by Morgoth, the last king himself. He is depicted as the great general who single-handedly held back the stars in order to stop the fate of the Empyreans from becoming reality. He led the army that held back the Scarlet Rot in Caelid, stopping its advance to the rest of the lands between. And he took it upon himself to continue his purpose long after his mind was lost to the effects of the rot. This is the Radahn we fight at the Great Festival, a large battle dedicated to his honor and to provide him with the only thing that could bring him peace: a true warrior's death. Combining our power with the likes of Blyde and Alexander, under the watchful gaze of Jaren, the witch hunter, we are able to bring closure to the legend of the greatest general and demigod in the lands between. The story, the setup, the characters, and the emotional charge, everything worked together to bring an incredible story with an incredible conclusion. Funnily enough, up until Shadow of the Erdtree, this fight was completely optional. Now with the DLC, everyone is forced to go through him, but I'm sure that there were those that never fought him until it was required. This is the memory that I had of Radahn, the legacy that I held dear to my heart as my absolute favorite character in the game. Unfortunately, Shadow of the Erdtree destroys it. The Radahn that we fight at the Gate of Divinity is a mirror of the great general in his prime, fruit of the combination of his body and soul with the soul of Mog, the demigod that was originally accused of Miquella's kidnapping but, as we later find out, turns out to have been the victim of a charm. We fight this Radahn and, once we beat him, he takes a knee and requires the assistance of Miquella, who completed his ascension at the Gates of Divinity. The newly formed god steps up to join Radahn in the fight, empowering all of his attacks and instilling him with newfound energy. In the end, after we are victorious, both entities fizzle out of existence. This is not a good image for Radahn. The greatest demigod who could have pursued his own ambitions as Elden Lord and brought upon his own personal age has been relegated as the consort of another. Instead of bringing forth an era of power and war fueled by the great Red Mane army, the great general is used as a tool to pursue the Age of Compassion. Now, we can discuss what we believe would make a better age for the Golden Order, but I am sure that we can all agree that Radahn would not usher in compassion. A character that was once filled with pride, honor, and consequence is now turned into a weapon, mindless and emotionless. Sure, some would argue that Radahn was already mindless and emotionless when his mind was taken by the rot, and they would be right. The difference here is that having his mind and sanity eaten by the rot was his choice in order to fulfill his purpose. He sacrificed himself for his own ambition. With Miquella, he was brought back, his warrior's death defiled, only to be used. Maybe you, my dear viewer, believe that this is not important. Maybe you believe that these matters of lore do not matter when it comes to judging a boss fight. There is nothing wrong with this line of thinking, but personally, I believe that it is the difference between a perfect boss fight and a wasted opportunity. Just look at Baal the Dread, a magnificent boss fight that was made perfect by the inclusion of Egon and their feud. When you take a boss that is well done mechanically and you add its own story and lore, it becomes unforgettable. There are other examples as well. Artorias, the Abyss Walker, Yorm, the Giant, Ludwig, the Holy Blade, all made more memorable because they had a great story behind them told either on screen by the game itself, by the quest of a side character, or by the environment and item descriptions. Having good lore will never turn a bad boss into a good one, but it will certainly turn a good boss into a great one. I did not get this with Promised Consort Radahn. In fact, I got the complete opposite effect. The way that he was treated left a large sour taste in my mouth. He did not deserve it, and neither did we. To me, Radahn died at the festival in Caelid. Nothing will ever change my mind. After all of this is said and done, the biggest problem with the final boss lies in the fact that it is such a missed opportunity. Promised Consort Radahn had the potential to be one of the greatest experiences ever distilled into a boss fight. Much like Slave Knight Gale for the conclusion of Dark Souls 3, Promised Consort Radahn could have left Elden Ring atop the pedestal of boss fight experiences. There are three things that, always in my opinion, could have been magnified to bring the player to a conclusion that is much more fulfilling and satisfying than the one we actually got. These three things are the setup, the setting, and the conclusion. Starting with the boss setup. This is the concept that describes the physical idea of the boss as well as the mechanical implications that are presented to the player. As an example, let's use the Tree Sentinel boss fight. The boss setup for the Tree Sentinel is a heavy armored mounted combatant that combines the speed of their horse with the reach of their weapon. From this, the player understands that they have two options. They can either go toe-to-toe with the boss, penetrating its reach and dealing with the horse's movement, or they can use Torrent to challenge the boss in a bout of mounted combat. This is easy to see. Now, what was the boss setup for Promised Consort Radahn? This boss was represented in two phases. In the first phase, as we mentioned before, we fight Radahn in his prime, facing the might of the great general in all of his glory, with some additional power from the soul of Mog. Once we defeat the first phase, we move on to the second one, in which Miquella joins Radahn to increase his power. Miquella's contribution is latching onto Radahn's shoulders and neck, while adding a few new attacks to his arsenal alongside the light pillars and after images. I am sure that those of you that have played Dark Souls 3 immediately realize the familiarity with this setup. It is very similar, if not the same, as the Twin Princes fight. First, we fight Lorien, crippled and mute, and once we defeat him, his brother Lothric joins the fight, clutching to the shoulders of Lorien, much like Miquella does with Radahn. This new combination empowers Lorien in a very similar manner to how the new deity empowers the great general of the Red Mane army. In my opinion, having promised Consort Radahn follow the same setup as the Twin Princess really takes away from the magnitude of the boss fight. It puts Radahn in a worse place, but it also takes away from the importance that Miquella should hold. Neither of these characters benefited from this fight. It is obvious from my exposition that I would do something different, and my solution would be to separate them. I would have had the player fight Radahn first as the consort, and once we defeat him, we earn the right to move on to challenging the brand new god. In this way, as two separate fights, FromSoft could have explored different ways of making each character shine in their own light. For example, we can fight Radahn with a much higher influence from Mog's soul. Maybe Mog agrees to fight, maybe he doesn't, and we can experience their internal dialogue. In the end, the two souls of the demigods are defeated and they find peace as brothers of a defiled lineage. Once we beat them, we are treated to a separate fight with Miquella. Maybe we fight a fully ascended and powerful Miquella, or maybe we interrupt the ascension and fight a weaker, incomplete Miquella, just like we did in Demon Souls when we go into the old one to fight a defiled and decrepit King Alond that can barely move. FromSoft already did a similar setup with Radahn and Elden Beast. Each of them having their own fight allows the player to get a better sense of what each character represented and their different fighting styles. I believe that Radahn and Miquella would have felt better if they were treated as two different battles. The setup that we received, repeating what was already done with Twin Princess, in my opinion, is a waste of potential. My next point is actually quite positive, but it comes with a disastrous ending, as I want to talk about the setting of the promised Consort Radahn boss fight. I think that the battleground in which we fight Radahn is very cool. I like the concept of a shadow temple coming into reality. I like the concept of scaling to the top of an era limb, reaching the grand staircase and pushing towards the Gate of Divinity, where we find Radahn blocking our passage. The build-up towards the fight was great, and the battlefield itself had ample real estate to move about, as well as a very good atmosphere that made me believe the importance of the bout that I was going to engage in. My issue with it, and probably the largest and biggest missed opportunity in the whole DLC, comes in the shape of the Gates of Divinity. It is absolutely criminal that FromSoft places us in this setting, in front of the Gates of Divinity, doorway to godhood as used by Miquella and most importantly Marika before him, and they do not let us interact with it. Not only that, but we can't even approach the gates, as the small staircase that leads to it is conveniently destroyed and we can't call upon Torrent to let us scale it. If I were to have any power whatsoever, I would have made it so that the player can enter these gates. In fact, going back to the boss setup, I would have loved to fight Radahn in front of the gates, and then, after we defeat him, have the option of going into the gates to fight Miquella, and either interrupt his ascension or beat the shit out of him after he has ascended. The Gates of Divinity are the perfect separation point for two fights, and it really puts the accent on the difference between consort and god. That being said, I understand that what I want might not be the best, or maybe it is too difficult to make happen and turn it into a reality. But still, at the very least, let us interact with these gates. Maybe give us an option to either open the gates for ourselves, becoming a god, or close them for good, stopping this ascension from ever happening again. Allow us to either perpetrate or break the cycle, much like we did with the kindling of the flame back in Dark Souls 1. Once we make our choice, treat the players to a cutscene and call it a day. It does not have to be anything large, just enough to give the player the sense of satisfaction and some insight into these gates, which are one of the most important aspects of Elden Ring's lore. Instead, we are blocked from even getting close to them, and it ruins the whole setting because it turns the most important area of the game into a circular coliseum that, when we are done with it, serves no other purpose. The setting of this boss fight could have been perfect. It already feels really good, but it was completely ruined in the end. This is probably what made me feel the worst once I finished the DLC. There was a lot of build up to this moment, and not being able to interact with the Gates of Divinity made them feel distant and, honestly, quite pointless. It could have been amazing, but we are left with the biggest missed opportunity in the whole of Shadow of the Erdtree. And of course, we need to talk about the ending of Shadow of the Erdtree and the conclusion that it provides to the full Elden Ring experience. So, once we defeat Promised Consort Radahn, both him and Miquella fizzle out of existence, signaling our victory. In terms of rewards, we are treated to the remembrance of Promised Consort Radahn, which allows us to pick from two identical copies of Radahn's swords, but each with a different dash of war, and then the miracle of Miquella's light. Furthermore, we are able to pick up a piece of headgear, Miquella's crown, called the Circlet of Light. All in all, I believe that these are very good, tangible rewards. The swords are fun to use, the miracle is really strong, and the headgear looks very cool for paladin builds, which I favor. I believe that these are good spoils for such a difficult fight, and the items we get are appropriate to the lore and the strength that a final boss brings to the table. Furthermore, we are also treated to a dream sequence in which we see Miquella in the past speaking about the promise between him and Radahn and how their relation came to be fruit of a long-standing agreement that Radahn was going to help Miquella reach his Age of Compassion. At the very end, it is revealed to us that the events of Shadow of the Erdtree were planned all along, even when the Tarnished are making the push towards the throne. We even get a snippet of lore from Promised Radahn's armor, in which we are revealed exactly what Malenia said to Radahn during their fight in Caelid that led to the blooming of the Scarlet Rot flower. In essence, throughout the heat of battle and right before their stalemate, Malenia speaks to Radahn and tells him to remember the promise that he made to Miquella. Needless to say, my dear viewer, to me this ending is completely unsatisfying. The main reason why I feel this lack of satisfaction is this ending confuses me. I honestly believe that it does not make a lot of sense, taking into consideration the events of the base game and the lore that we were given in the base Elden Ring. Let's assume that what we are revealed in Shadow of the Erdtree is completely true. Let's accept that Miquella and Radahn had a long-standing agreement in which Radahn was going to be Miquella's consort and help perpetuate his Age of Compassion. Let's accept it. If this is the case, then why did Malenia, sister and blade of Miquella, attack Radahn, release the rot upon the lands between, and infect Radahn, heavily weakening his battle prowess, all while reminding him of his promise to Miquella? If this were to be the case, why did Radahn siege the Leyndell capital, attempting to usurp the throne? Radahn would have taken over if it were not for Morgoth kicking his ass. And furthermore, if this were the case, why would Radahn utilize the last of his power to stop the movement of the stars, and in this way halt the Empyrean's fate from being fulfilled? Sure, this was to stop Ranni, but let's remember that Miquella is also an Empyrean as well. It is in Miquella's best interest to have the stars resume their path, stars that Radahn stopped. Why would Miquella's promised consort go to such lengths in order to act against the wishes of the would-be god he swore to help? I don't have answers to these questions. That being said, not having answers is not the problem. The souls are filled with open-ended and unanswered questions. This isn't new. The problem arises from the fact that the answers that Shadow of the Erdtree does give us contradict those that we receive in the base game. I feel like in this case, the DLC and the base game are fighting each other for seemingly no reason at all, much like Malenia and Radahn did. This is a tremendous contrast to what we find in Dark Souls 1, where its DLC reveals the story of one of Lordran's greatest heroes, Artorias the Abyss Walker, and then uses time travel logic to double back and make the player the #1 protagonist. In the same way, the Ringed City does a great job of concluding Dark Souls 3, giving the players the blood of the Dark Souls seeped from the body of Gale, who had consumed the Dark Soul itself when he saw that the pygmies had long dried up. In both of these examples, the revelations of the DLC are very important, but also coherent with what the main game had already established. Seeing how Shadow of the Erdtree seemingly goes against the events already established in the base game left me in a confused state that made the ending completely unsatisfying. I didn't expect to be told absolutely everything. This is a Souls game after all. But I do expect that what I am actually told is coherent with what was already established. Maybe I am not intelligent enough to understand these connections. Maybe I missed part of the lore that ties everything together. It is completely possible that my confusion is the fruit of my own personal fault. Be that as it may, I cannot shake this lack of satisfaction. Final bosses are a very important part of any video game. It is the last fight, the last interaction that every player will have with the story of the game that they are playing. Final bosses are extremely difficult to design because they need to be balanced and they need to be memorable. They need to provide an adequate challenge, they need to be fun, and they need to make sense. In one single word, they need to be satisfying. If this is not the case, then the player will be left with a sour taste in their mouth that could ruin the rest of the experience. This is not exactly fair, but it is the truth. When it comes to Shadow of the Erdtree, I was not satisfied with the final boss. I found Promised Consort Radahn to have many missed opportunities that could have elevated it to an incredible position, and I also believe that parts of it actively go against what was already established in the main game. On the other hand, I found that its difficulty was well balanced, and it provided a good fight with appropriate rewards. Overall, I did not like the final boss. That being said, this is only one part of a magnificent game. Things like these keep Shadow of the Erdtree from being a perfect experience. That being said, I will not change my opinion on one matter. My dear viewer, even with all of its faults, Shadow of the Erdtree continues to be the best experience that we can obtain in the current video game market. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope I get to see you on the next one.